is I'll just go through. I'm going to try and make this a bit light. I don't want to talk too much because that could be boring, and it only comes alive when we get questions from other people. So this is Renato Castellani, or Castellani, some people pronounce it. Born in Argentina, but moved to Italy as a young boy. Studied architecture at Milan University. That became quite a prominent thing. His first film, he did various writing skills, but he did Solo di Roma, I hope I pronounced that properly, was nominated for a Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, but lost out only to Laurence Olivier's Hamlet, 1948. His next film was I Primavera, The Spring, 1950. And he co-wrote the screenplay. And he wrote it partly with Cesare Zavattini, the neo-realist writer. This was part of his trilogy. The third one was Two Pennyworth of Hope, which was quite successful. But he wrote both the story and the screenplay himself, and it was the most successful of these films. It was nominated for a BAFTA and tied with Orson Welles' Othello for the Palme d'Or at Cannes. So by 1954, Italian cinema is actually going very strong. In 1954 alone, Italian cinema released 152 major films, which was 2/3 the number that Hollywood did. So it was a big output. He was an award-winning director at the time, and he was chosen to do Romeo and Juliet, which was a big deal. The Rank organisation gave a budget of £500,000, a lot of money in those days. That was the same budget that Zeffirelli was given initially, though that went up when he was making his film later. Also a hidden cost in that the Rank organisation, who had shares in Odeon cinemas in Canada and Ireland and Australia, actually went out and bought outright a number of Odeon cinemas in the UK. I think they bought them all. I don't have the exact number or how much they paid for it. And they bought them with the sole intent, not the sole intention, the intention for buying them was to release Romeo and Juliet on the same day throughout Britain, make it a social event, make it a big event for everyone to come and see it. So they were putting a lot on this film. And 1952, Castellani was holding a press conference with Rank. They have launched a sort of search for Scarlett O'Hara type thing, and they were saying they were looking for someone. And he was at the press conference and was asked by one of the journalists how much of Shakespeare's texts would he be keeping. And much to the shock of those who were seated with him at the top table, he said not one word. That he would be basing it on the Italian folk tales before Shakespeare. He would write the script entirely himself, and there would be no Shakespeare in it. This caused a lot of panic within Rank, because they could market and sell Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, throughout the world. They could not market and sell Masuccio's, Bandello's, or Deporto's Romeo and Juliet, and they wouldn't want to spend money on the film anyway. So he was told, you do it our way or you're out. So he went along with it, but he wasn't happy at all. And he kept putting things in the film that related back to the Italian sources. Now, one of the things when you watch the film, this is the first thing you see on the screen, Romeo and Juliet, colour by Technicolor. Now, 2 years before the film's release, in 1952, whilst in England on his casting trip, he was asked about the film, and the first thing he said, his first words were, "It will be in colour. We will use no studios, and it will be available in Italian as well as English." He said the Italian version would use the same cast who would dub it in Italian. And he was working out the screenplay himself so that all the sentences had the same amount of syllables. So it all looked very authentic. Now, Technicolor became a huge part of this. It sort of overwhelmed the film. And it shows that his priorities were quite strong at this point. Technicolor first. And a big thing about not shooting in studio. It was the first Romeo and Juliet film not to be set in a studio. And he was doing this as part of the neo-realist thing to make it as real as possible. Adapted for the screen by Renato Castellani himself. He made another big thing. The next thing was Robert Krasker, who'd worked with some of the top people. He'd worked with Olivier, a successful cinematographer. Then it's interesting here, costumes designed by Leonore Fini. Leonore Fini was an artist, surrealist artist. These are two of her paintings. She was coincidentally also born in Argentina, escaped from a very oppressive father. Her and her brother made their way to Italy, where in a sort of Shakespearean drama, the mother disguised the little girl as a little boy because the father was spending out private detectives to try and kidnap the child and bring them back. Now, Leonore Fini was chosen, I think, because she was Italian. He was trying to steep this in as much Italian culture as possible. But it was a curious choice. All Leonore Fini's women are quite strong, quite sexual, and this is at complete odds as to how Juliet is portrayed in this film. Doesn't match at all. And also, here are three of the costumes that she's worn, that she designed. They're all a bit surreal. For all of going for trying to make it as realistic as possible, when you have these costumes appearing in front of you, it makes it more theatrical. It removes a layer of authenticity, and I think causes a visual imbalance. This is Romeo in the centre of Romeo. I couldn't get the screen to stop in time. The little ankle boots. When you see this is just after the wedding scene, before he meets with Tybalt, and he's like a camp superhero sidekick. It was a very, very curious choice of costumes. Here we see Princess Escalus, again looking quite strange, purple gloves. There's a lot of purple in this film, I think purely because the artist liked to colour purple. So, it won a few awards. It was nominated for BAFTAs when the film was released. BAFTAs for Best Film, Best British Film, Best Screenplay. It won Best Cinematography from the British Board of Cinematographers and won Best Director from the esteemed American Board of Review. However, the biggest success by far was that it won the Golden Lion at Venice. Now, but that's surprising because other films in the same year at Venice, Visconti's Senso, Fellini's La Strada, Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, and Kazan's On the Waterfront. These films regularly appear in greatest films of all time lists. And even if people haven't seen the films, they've heard of them. So that was a big, big win initially. It got a standing ovation at Venice. It was shown in English without Italian subtitles. And the crowd still went rapturous for it. So, moving into the background and the casting, Castellani had never worked with professional actors before. He wanted to keep that. And he cast in the lead role of Juliet, Susan Shentall. Susan Shentall was 18 at the time, 1952. Secretarial College in London, and her parents came and took her out to the Caprice restaurant, where Castellani would dine quite often with Lord Rank. And he had left instructions with the maitre d' to look for a girl of particular looks. He said she must be, I'm quoting that he'd written down because maitre d' wrote his autobiography and he noted this in it. She must be between 16 and 18, blonde and blue-eyed, as they are in Verona even today. She must look simple, innocent, and unsophisticated. Now that was, as if he wants to mould and do her. She also, as we said, bore a striking resemblance to Grace Kelly, who was possibly the biggest female actress at the time. So she was in there. Stories went round that she was offered the part immediately. She was not offered the part. She was offered a chance to audition for the role. It took her 3 auditions to land the part. The third audition was in colour, and she worked on that third audition with Laurence Harvey. This is Laurence Harvey down on the left. He had that classic handsome cinema star look at the time. That's Montgomery Clift on the right. Montgomery Clift had just had a huge hit with From Here to Eternity the year before. Strangely enough, Laurence Harvey had been spotted in the very same restaurant just 2 weeks before. And the maitre d', Mario, said to him, "There's your Romeo." And he said, "You're right, now go out and find me a Juliet." So they were both chosen primarily for how they looked. And one was a professional actor who'd done some theatre, and one had never acted before. The not acting before caused a bit of resentment. It's very difficult to find out who else auditioned or applied for the role. Joan Collins, we know, auditioned for it, but was turned down, and she was quite upset. Not upset, but she mentioned it in her autobiography, saying she went for the role, but it was given to an unknown actress, which Susan Shentall actually read and found quite funny, because she was a fan of Joan Collins. Claire Bloom was approached, apparently. She had just done a very successful Romeo and Juliet at the Edinburgh Festival, but she wasn't interested. So moving on a bit, it's quite interesting. This is the first scene that we see of Verona. Strong concrete battlements. There's a lot of concrete in this film. There's a lot of barred doors, iron bars. There's a lot of low ceilings, very claustrophobic. And throughout the film, Castellani repeatedly returns to visual motifs of stone and iron, suggesting claustrophobia and imprisonment. And this is done in much the same way that Orson Welles turned to stone and low ceilings in Macbeth in 1948. Now, down below that, quite strangely, you'll see Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Why is that here? Venus, amongst other things, the goddess of love and beauty, took a hand in establishing Roman people and state. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Eva, and Nero all claim to be descended from her. She's the mother of Cupid, symbolises, amongst other things, love, beauty, purity, and chastity. Castellani wanted to have this scene modified, and the opening scene for Juliet. He wanted her rising naked from a scalloped bath, shot from the back, so you would see her back, to symbolise this painting. But her mother was over, chaperoning her with a young sister. The mother phoned the father back in England, and he absolutely totally objected to it. So it was taken out, which is why you have this strange opening scene of handmaidens drying Juliet's feet. That's the first time you see Juliet in film. It's certainly a bit odd. But the connection with purity is quite interesting, because that takes us back to 1936, when Norma Shearer was modelled strand by strand on the painting on the right. It's a fresco by Fra Angelico of the Annunciation. This is the Angel Gabriel. And Castellani is on record of actually saying how much he hated this film. And he's saying he got into filmmaking to redress the imbalance of this dreadful film had made to Romeo and Juliet. I don't believe that's true. I think he's just stirring publicity, because in his own film version, the very same fresco, this is a fresco as it appears, this is the Angel Gabriel on the left, he has, in his film, used the same fresco for a publicity shot. The scene of Juliet in front of the fresco is not in the film. This is taken from Susan Shentall's family's collection of stuff. They showed it to me when I was down there. But he used this to promote the film. And it all seems very much that they're still controlling, looking for Juliet to be purity. And he gave an interview with the Manchester Guardian, September the 23rd, 1954. And he stated that the portrayal of Juliet in this film will centre on her chastity. But most of all, Romeo and Juliet are very young, and their story is the story of the cool wonder of chaste first love. Now, by doing this, Castellani is halting the progression of Juliet as she is in Shakespeare's text, where she goes from the young innocent maiden in Act 1 but makes a rapid progression to a strong, independent woman in Act 5. So by focusing purely on her chastity and purity, he's stopping that happen. She's moving in the play from maiden to wife to widow. So that's part of the tragedy. The whole life that she leads is within 5 days. He was given a bit of a hard time by some of the press, saying that he likes to work with naturals. A bit of racism came in, saying they could do this in Italy where everyone has a story to tell, but if you're doing it in England, you must use proper actors and actresses, etc. Now, he did cut a lot from Shakespeare's text, a great deal. He cut a lot from Act 1, including Queen Mab's speech. He cut Mercutio down to the smallest of parts, which affects how much it affects his relationship with Juliet, because he moves from relationship with Mercutio to the relationship with Juliet. But he said that he thought Mercutio was a flaw, a beautiful flaw. Mercutio is in the earlier Italian versions, but he's actually a very small part. It's developed greatly by Shakespeare, more or less invented by Shakespeare. Now, we're going to move into an area here which I think will quite interest Fred, who likes the odd conspiracy theory. 3 pictures taken from the film. There are various theories that Shakespeare didn't write plays. So-and-so wrote them, such and such a person wrote them. My favourite one is that Queen Elizabeth I wrote them, which is very good because she wrote some of the best ones years after she was dead. On the other side of that, there's a theory that Shakespeare did write the plays and he wrote them in Italy, that he was in Italy, and this is where he formulated the whole thing. Now, one of the things they use to back this theory up is the scene of Romeo and Benvolio in the grove of sycamore trees at the beginning of the play, because there's no grove of sycamore trees mentioned in any of the Italian short stories beforehand. It's only in Shakespeare. And if you go to Verona today, out the West Gate, there is a grove of sycamore trees, which can be traced back to the time where Romeo and Juliet was apparently set. Now, that's because in the places, Madam, an hour before the worshipped sun peered forth the golden window of the east, a troubled mind drove me to walk abroad, where underneath the grove of sycamore that westward rooteth from the city side, so early walking did I see your son. So they're saying this is Castellani supporting that theory that Shakespeare was in Italy and the Italian culture permeated into his plays. Now, there's also in the play, Shakespeare's play, there's Villa Franca. But before Shakespeare, there's Villa Franca, which means Freetown. In the earlier versions, Juliet is ordered by her father to go to Villa Franca, but in Shakespeare's version of Romeo and Juliet, he uses the term Freetown, and it's used by Prince Aeschylus when he is punishing or speaking to Montague and Capulet after the brawl. He says, "You, Capulet, shall go along with me, and Montague, come you this afternoon to know our further pleasure in this case to Old Freetown, our common judgment place." Common means public here. Now, Villa Franca, Old Freetown, actually exists. It's a medieval fortification. This is the 2 pictures that you're seeing on the right. And it's about 16 kilometres outside Verona. Furthermore, at the time, it was ruled over by Prince Bartolomeo della Scala. Della Scala, the Latin version of Della Scala is Aeschylus. So the theory was put round that Castellani was supporting the theory that Shakespeare had written the plays but had been to Italy, took it from there. It's a good theory. This seems to be evidence of it, but there's one major flaw, and it is a major flaw. The comment about the Sycamore Grove and the comment about going to Old Freetown are both absent from Castellani's film. So it looks like really that's Old Freetown in the background of the sycamore tree. And I think it's just there to give the place some authenticity, fortifications, trying to make it old, you know, give it a more realistic look. The next two pictures. This is actually a theme that Castellani was quite fond of, one that was popular within the neorealist movement of the time. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. The Vagabondaggi, which the story unfolds and takes place during wanderings in the city. This is the youth who wander in the city, and this highlights the protagonist's struggles in an urban context. In such films, architecture, spaces in the town, and public areas form a major part of the films where conflict and struggles take place. And it was a theme that he carried on to Romeo and Juliet. Architecture played a big part on this, partly to make it look more realistic, partly because of his passion for architecture. But it's noticeable that Romeo wanders wherever he wants to in the town, on his own. No doors are bolted. Barred entrances are unlocked and unguarded. This is in direct contrast to Juliet. Everywhere we see Juliet, there are bars on the window, bars on the doors, doors are locked, low ceilings. And the very rare occasions that she's outside, she's escorted everywhere. This is part of the theme of the balcony speech. Most of the balcony speech tends to be cut from films. There's a great deal in it about falconry. And the reason of the falconry is because it's alluding to Romeo being free, flying above the conflict, flying above commitment to the conflict. Will he allow himself to be tamed by Juliet? But this is the physical aspect of it. Romeo gets to wander wherever he wants. Now, this is quite an interesting point, these two pictures. The bottom one on the left, this is Rosaline. As in the 1936 film, Rosaline is in this film. Rosaline is not in the play. She's mentioned in the play, but she's not in it. In this film, she's actually also given a speaking part. She's giving him the mask. This is the mask that Capulet has thrown away in anger. She picks it up and gives it to Romeo, sort of transference of the prime male in the play, or in the film. And she says, put this mask on and leave this place at once. Dressed dark conservative clothing. She's polite conversation with a male guest. She's very pretty, very beautiful, but she's slightly dour. And it has to be said, there is nothing in this short scene they have together that suggests there's been any spark of infatuation or love or anything at all behind them. It's really quite flat. It didn't work at all. The one on the right is quite interesting. I'm including that because the one on the left is Romeo at the banquet. The one on the right is Romeo leaving the banquet, and he's wearing a completely different outfit. Now, that is not purely a mistake, because Castellani does this throughout the film. Between the scene of him about to leave the banquet and actually leaving the banquet, there's a short scene of Juliet kneeling in front of a votive candle and praying. Then there's a fade to black, quite a lengthy fade to black, which suggests the passage of a fairly long period of time. Castellani does this throughout the film to give an impression of a much longer period of time passing, which is what happens in the earlier versions of Romeo and Juliet, not Shakespeare's version. Shakespeare's version, from beginning to end, takes place over 5 days. You can count the days by the amount of time dawn is mentioned in the play. It also shows the preoccupation with colour and Technicolor. Technicolor was very expensive in the 50s, but it was a lot cheaper to film in Rome. It's part of the reason they shot it there. Now, these are further things about imprisonment, confinement of Juliet's bars. This is the balcony, barred balcony. Even at the banquet, there's bars on the windows. When she dances, she's held like a chain. She's not allowed any free movement on her own. She wears this white costume with flashings of red, the white to signify purity. Everyone else wears deep red. Now, she's also filmed exclusively in the company of others or in the background, which is completely different to how Romeo is filmed. He's always filmed in close-up or three-quarters close-up. And her only close-up, the one we see in the bottom left, is after she's found out that Romeo's a Montague. Now, that's the director. She's crying at this point. By shooting this way, he's allowing Juliet her only close-up when she reacts to the news of Romeo's identity. He's guiding the audience to see Juliet solely in relation to and as an extension of Romeo. She's also got her eyes downcast. Her eyes are downcast virtually throughout this entire banqueting sequence, which is completely different to how Romeo's done. When Romeo is moving forward, he's always, you can see there's nobody in the background. Although there are a lot of candelabras and props in this scene, they're all removed from the background when Romeo, Laurence Harvey's moving up. And he moves quite dramatically towards this same pillar 3 times. And when he speaks, he looks meaningfully into the middle distance. The background music actually lowers, and he makes this melodramatic theatrical convention of the leading man, and he talks, copying the mannerisms, the vocal mannerisms of John Gielgud, which he does from the very beginning. The first words he says in the film at the Sycamore Grove, pardon me, when he asks what's going on, it's 9 o'clock, and he replies, "Is the day so young?" The sing-song Gielgud approach, which was very popular at the time. Olivier accused Gielgud of sometimes hiding behind his vocal traits, which I think is a fair comment. But the big difference here is the way the two actor and actresses are treated. Juliet is very much an inferior part to Romeo in this film, whereas Juliet is the mainstay of the film. There are a number of key scenes in the film. Romeo, I think, only really has one, which is the banishment speech, which has to be right. Juliet has about 5, but she's very much a minor character here. Now, we're going back to the hairstyle of Rosaline. Renaissance art motifs permeate this film from the very start, all going back to making this an Italian story. There was a lot of confusion about this hairstyle. Someone suggested it represented an architectural dome, an architect's dome somewhere in Italy. But it's termed a balzo. And it was someone called Antony Guarante, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who correctly identified it as modelled on Pisanello's fresco of St. George and the Princess of Trezibond, which is in Verona's church of St. Anastasia. These sort of hints are there all through the film. Here we see Capulet in his study, and it's based on Raphael's painting of Pope Julius II. The colour of his robes and the colour of the wall virtually match, but I think that might just be a coincidence because of the variety of strange things with cautions. And then again, we have even the boys who are singing at the Capulet Ball. That's based on Luca della Robbia's sculptured singing gallery in Florence. This was all done deliberately, permeated the film. Baz Luhrmann did a similar thing in 1996, but he used graffiti, he used posters, adverts on the sides of cars, on walls, but he really did this in relation to other Shakespeare plays. They're doing it here to reflect back to Renaissance Italy. There's another one here, which is, we're coming to St. Lawrence and the Jailer. This is another Fra Angelico based painting here on the right. Now, this is part of the clip which we didn't see earlier on. Romeo is getting married to Juliet, and they're doing it through this grill. Now, in the painting, we see a man kneeling beside a friar, as viewed through the iron grill of a cell door. In the film, Shakespeare's Friar Laurence becomes Saint Laurence, while Romeo takes the role of the jailer. It's not just another reference to Fra Angelico's work and an insertion of Christian iconography which permeates the film, but it's also using architecture to suggest the theme of imprisonment. But it's also worthy of noting that it's Friar Laurence who passes the lily to Juliet, not her husband, not Romeo. The lily is a symbol of purity, going back to this purity aspect of Juliet, and it's particularly associated with the Virgin Mary, as are the Dominicans. Now he's dressed, we'll come back to talk about his habit in a minute here. The lily is associated with the Dominican order, who used it as a symbol of their own chastity and their devotion to the Virgin Mary. St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order, is often painted or sculpted holding a lily and a book. Now, moving on slightly to the wedding scene on the left. This caused a lot of confusion at the time. Castellani films the marriage between Romeo and Juliet, something that doesn't happen on stage in Shakespeare's play. It's off stage, but it happens in the previous Italian versions. In the film, she kneels in front of a heavily grilled window and looks out to a cloister where we see Romeo and Friar Laurence. The friar conducts a short wedding ceremony through the iron grille, and the couple are married. Now, much was read into this. Many academics, including Kenneth Rothwell, stated that this through the grille symbolised Pyramus and Thisbe proclaiming their love through a hole in the wall in A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's a drawing on the right-hand side, which I think is modelled on Leonardo DiCaprio. So quite a few folk agreed on this, and they were all wrong, every one of them. What we see down here well, before that, we'll talk about in the earlier versions. In Masuccio's version, there's a brief reference to it saying that the couple bribed an Augustan friar who married them in secret. In De Porto's version, the couple are married in a confessional, with Romeo on one side of the grate and Juliet on the other. And in Bandello's version of the tale, the couple are again married in a confessional, with the friar removing the grate or wicket as it's termed, allowing the newlyweds to kiss, and then he puts it back. Now, the marriage scene is filmed at the top there, bears a striking resemblance to the De Porto's version. Now, that painting down on the bottom left is an illustration by Guillaume Battista Gigola, and it shows Romeo and Juliet kissing through the open grille. This was used in a book of De Porto's story. That illustration was actually used in it. And you can see that Susan Shentall is dressed in a very similar way. She's got a mantilla, traditional Christian head covering for women, in the same style. Now, there's very little doubt in my mind that Castellani was using this again to reinforce the earlier Italian versions of the story. Now, the next two pictures are a bit strange. In Shakespeare's play, Friar Laurence is listed as being of the Franciscan order. Masuccio's version, he's simply described as being an Augustan friar. De Porto has a character belonging to the minor order of the Osservanza, and Bandello's narrative, he's described as belonging to the minor brotherhood. Now, Castellani's friar, if we go back a bit to the very beginning, he doesn't wear a recognisable habit. And I know this because here we are here. I took several stills of this film with Friar Laurence in it and sent it off to the Vatican with the Secretary of State, who is now our current Archbishop, knew someone who specialised in vestments, and he went through, checking these vestments against the history of vestments used by monks in the Catholic Church. And the official word back from the Vatican was, this costume is a fantasy. Part Franciscan, that's the one down here on the left. Part Dominican, that's the one on the right, there you can see the lily. And part Benedictine. People went through a lot of this saying, It was to do with the Benedictines preserving ancient texts, and Castellani was trying to preserve the ancient texts of the Italian folklore. Really, I think they've just overstated the case. I think it's purely the costume designer Leonore Finney going her own way, and Castellani just departing from Shakespeare's text because he wanted to. Now, there's further credence given to this later on in the film. This was something that was missed at the time, and I've not really read it anywhere else. But in Shakespeare's text, Friar Laurence explains to Juliet, they're talking about, how they're going to smuggle her out after faking her own death. He says, in the meantime, against thou shalt awake, shall Romeo by my letters know our drift, and hither shall we come, and he and I will watch thy waking, and that very night shall Romeo bear thee hence to Mantua. Now, in Castellani's version, as filmed, the lines are changed quite differently. In the film, Friar Laurence says, and I'm quoting here, in the meantime, against thou shalt awake, shall Romeo by my letter know our drift. Then I will watch thee waking, and secretly hither bring thee to this cell until the chapter day, which we in Mantua each year do hold at Easter time. With all the friars confused, our habits wearing, I'll bear thee hence to Romeo. Now, in Shakespeare's play and in this film, we're told that Juliet's birthday is almost upon us in the middle of July. Her birthday's at the end of July. By introducing the plan of hiding Juliet in a cell until Easter and smuggling her out disguised as a monk, Castellani is inferring that Juliet's, young beautiful Juliet, will hide in Friar Laurence's cell for around about 8 or 9 months. I don't think that's easy to accept. And I think it'd be a very strong challenge to his chastity and purity. I think the change that Castellani introduces here, it lends itself very, very closely to De Porto's version of the story, where events unfold during Lent. Juliet makes an excuse to attend confession during Lent, and later asks to attend a second confession, stating she would like to attend at Easter, which is in May. So that is done again, alongside disguising Juliet in monk's habit. It clearly lifts the story from Shakespeare's text and resets it firmly in an earlier Italian version of the play. Now, moving on to the funeral, the death of Romeo and Juliet. I'm missing out the death scene because we talked about it earlier and other stuff. There's not much complimentary to say about it. The death scene is very insipid. In fact, a lot of this film is insipid, particularly Laurence Harvey, I feel. And Juliet just stabs herself in the most, unconvincing manner. And they just expire. Now, it then fades to black and we cut to the scene where the cathedral door opens and underneath the large rose window there, opened by 2 altar servers wearing matching soutanas and surplices. Staff from the prince's household enter through the doorway and stand either side, allowing the prince to make a very solitary, grand, epic entrance. And he's followed by a servant walking 6 steps behind. And as he descends the stairs, in a very, very coordinated piece of stagecraft, we have 12 bishops wearing identical outfits and mitres, all coming in very solemnly, alongside female mourners on the left, who are all dressed identically. The bishops are robed as if to celebrate a high funereal mass. Colour coding here is very much the same. The bishops' purple vestments with gold edging match perfectly the purple of the dresses on each of the female mourners. These vestments were copied from the painting down here. Carpaccio's painting The Funeral of St. Ursula, also known as The Martyrdom of the Pilgrims and The Funeral of St. Ursula. So that could be a reference to Romeo and Juliet being pilgrims at the beginning of the play. Now, more female mourners enter the left again, dressed exactly the same way. No words are spoken, only sound. We hear the mournful pealing of a solitary church bell. The bishops and female mourners stop at the stairs as the prince makes a dramatic descent to the prone bodies of Romeo and Juliet. And behind Benvolio and Montague, just a short here on the left, are even more bishops, all wearing the same thing. The entire scene is stage managed on a vast scale and conflicts with the claim in the programme at the world premiere, this is not photograph theatre, but a film peopled with real characters. That was one of the criticisms, excuse me, I'm going to cough. One of the criticisms was that for a neo-realist director, Castellani spent an awful lot of time photographing and filming opulence, richness. Everyone's got very expensive robes, lives in wonderful places. He did carry some things which didn't go too well. In a lot of neo-realism films, you have to see the anguish of the protagonist, but he overdoes it here. All Laurence Harvey does, he's very full of remorse. He's like a wet fish, actually, all the way through. And there's one scene which is actually quite disturbing, when he's breaking into the tomb to see Juliet. He's breaking in using a full-length candle that he's picked up, and Paris comes in. And Romeo picks up the candle and smashes it down on his skull. It's a very, very brutal, violent murder that doesn't sit well with the character at all. And that's part of the problem with this film. Too many visual conflicts, too many conflicts of style, too many conflicts in acting style. So it quickly fell from grace. It got a short re-release after Zeffirelli's film came out, but I've never seen it shown on any television channel anyway. It wasn't available at all on DVD until fairly recently. I had to search far and wide to get a copy when I was starting this, and even then it was a dodgy Japanese copy, subtitled. Then it came out, a few came out. Now you can get it now. I think it's now on YouTube as well. It's a film, I think, it's not a great film. It's my favourite version of Romeo and Juliet, partly because so few people have seen it. It's worth watching because it's although it's set, historically, it's a very good snapshot of Italian filmmaking at the time, I think. And it's worth watching. And also, I was lucky enough to meet Susan Shentall's family, who gave me a great insight into the film. So that's it. That's my little talk on the 1954 film. I'm sorry if we went on too long. Would anyone like to ask me some questions, or does anyone get anything to say? Fred's waving. Can we Oh, do I pass this back to you, or do you take it back?
I think I'm unmuted, am I?
Hi, I can hear you now, Fred.
Good. Well, now, my dear friend, doing some very light research into this particular 54 adaptation of it, and you mentioned casting at the beginning, and I mean, you might take this with a pinch of salt. I'd like to hear your view or your comments or your views on it. I came across that Joan Collins was the original choice for Juliet. It's rather surprising given our cinematic experiences since then, but played by a Venetian gondolier. Mercurio was played by an architect. Yet, as you said, won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival. Best foreign film, Castellani is the best director. Shentall surpassed the demands of the role, but she never returned to the screen and got married, whatever it was. But that's, I wonder, having read a bit of this and looked at it in a bit more depth earlier on in the week, was he not trying to make Romeo and Juliet the great leveler? It's practiced, and it's one of these things where you get it in schools. In fact, in drama recently, we're doing the fight scene. I wonder if, I might be stretching the bounds of reality here, but I wondered if he was trying to make it with that casting and some of that cast. I know Gielgud was in it, but some of the roles that were played by non-actors, non-Shakespearean actors, because I think Shakespeare is sometimes seen as far removed from the average person. the schools people still no, not bloody Shakespeare, and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I wonder if Castellani, in some way, tried to make it a leveler, so it could be brought by the masses, it could be bought into by the masses, that given these roles to virtually non-actors.
Yes, I think he was. That was part of the thing about neo-realism. And I think that part of the problem was, as I said, that the clash of acting styles between Juliet and Romeo in this film. One is trying to play it, and she plays it, I think, fairly well, a very naturalistic approach to it. That the director would say to her before quite a lot of the takes, make your mind a blank, and I will tell you how to play this part. You know? Whereas Laurence Harvey had very set ideas how it should be played, very theatrical. When he was cast in this film, and there was a lot of publicity for it, and they were hoping, and there was expectation that it would be a huge, big success. Shakespeare films had gone through a sort of golden time in the late 40s, early 50s. He was signed by Stratford-on-Avon to come and play Romeo in Romeo and Juliet on the immediate release of this film. They thought, we'll cash in here. We'll have this guy who's going to be propelled to superstardom. It's this great Shakespearean actor. And we will have him here doing Romeo, the very same role on stage. So he did Romeo on stage, and he didn't get good reviews. And the reviews, a lot of them said the same thing. He was too stagey. He was too wooden. He was too pronounced. He seemed to be more concerned in retaining the clipped English accent. And it didn't sit with the rest of the actors. And I think that was part of the imbalance of it. So it was an absolutely very good, very true thing to say. The idea that I think Castellani had of doing it based on the Italian folktales, filming it like this, I thought would be very interesting. But I can totally see why Rank would say, we're not doing that. We're not giving you this £500,000 plus the other thing to make a film based on a story that everyone expects to be Shakespeare, but isn't. And the critics after the film came out, you could split them down the middle, really. Particularly the British critics. There was an element of sort of xenophobia, cultural snobism, racism, that an Italian couldn't possibly understand the complexities of Shakespeare's language, which was complete nonsense. And I've always said that, with a few notable exceptions, King John, Richard II, Shakespeare's plays are not purely about the language. They're about the passions behind the language, the fear, the anger, the hatred, the jealousy, the burning ambition, which are the same in people in every single country in the world, which is why Shakespeare is so popular in every single country in the world. And I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be done in Italian or French or, Korean or whatever. There is an inherent snobbery of Shakespeare's language. This film suffered for it. He suffered for it because he was Italian. He did make some mistakes. It's a disjointed film, but there's some very good bits in there. It's certainly worth watching.
Tony, I've got a couple of questions.
Hello, Kim. Fire away, please.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for a very illuminating and interesting talk.
Thank you.
And it really came alive with all the pictures and their explanations and the paintings. Apparently, Susan Shentall was thought
Shentall.
Oh, sorry, was thought by some to be too old for the 14-year-old Juliet. Well, do you think she was? And also, do you have any thoughts? Susan Shentall only made one film, and also, why was she called the Forgotten Juliet? Perhaps those last two are linked.
Well, no, I don't think she was too old. I don't think there was any attempt to portray them as 14-year-old in this film.
Mm-hmm.
And on a broader scale, I don't think, although in today's modern age, there's so much in the news just now about child abuse, etc., and it becomes a very touchy topic. It's not that important in the play.
Mm-hmm.
the perceived age of Juliet is a bit of a thing now, but in the play and the fact that her birthday it's tied in with the fact that all they're basically saying is, because marriages were much younger in those days, and even until recently, I think in California, up until sometime in the 1900s, you could get married at 11 years old. And I think even just the other day, I think I read in the newspaper that the age of consent in Japan, they're changing it to 16. At the moment, it's 13. So there's a strange thing about that. But at the time, they were saying the marriage was merely to show that Lammas Eve was a time when they celebrated because the harvest was ready. And during that time, they would have village festivities. It would go on for a week or 2 weeks, and you could have trial marriages during that point. People could go and get married, and if it didn't work out in 2 weeks, it would carry on. But basically what he was saying at this point is that Juliet is ready to be married. Whether it's 14 or 16 or 18 is immaterial. At the time, and in the earlier versions as well, to have an unmarried daughter was at a certain point a dangerous thing, because they would be kidnapped. And she's mentioned, I think it's in Bandello's version, he refers to her as an expensive piece of property, which he has to move on. There was no attempt to do it as 14. Some of the later films, there was one, the most recent one, which I thought was dreadful. They tried to bring the focus on the age as the big thing, that it's all about teenage love. It's not. The play is not about teenage love. The fact that they're teenagers is just a byproduct of the time. It's about first love, which is a completely different thing, which is why Romeo is so shocked that he's found himself in love. He thought he was in love before. He was a bit of a lad. In all the other versions as well, he's a bit of a lad about town, seducing women all over the place. And quite often you'll see in the film, they mispronounce the line. They always say things like, have I not loved till now? And it's actually, the emphasis should be on the end of that sentence. It should be, have I not loved till now? There's an incredulity about it. And this is vital to the play, because I mentioned earlier on the thing about Romeo's major scene is the banishment scene. The banishment scene is the most difficult for an actor to play in this play, because he has to come across realistically as Romeo has been besotted or obsessed with people before. Friar Laurence mentions that in the play. Suddenly he finds himself deeply in love, passionately in love, a love he does not feel could have existed before, and he's suddenly exposed to it. He's full of wonderment to it. He's embracing it with all his soul, and it's ripped from him suddenly, unjustly, with inestimable pain. He has to convey that over. Now, it's difficult to do when you're so young, as a young actor. It's not about teenage, I said, it's about first love. And this is the thing. One of the best Juliets I saw was, and her name's gone right out of my head, Peter O'Toole's ex-wife, Shan Phillips. I saw Shan Phillips in an adaptation of this Juliet and her Romeo, and she was 76. And she was wonderful, absolutely wonderful, because they played it as first love. And that actually gave more credence to the tragedy of this. That in that version of the play, the actor did say it, have I not loved till now? In that version of the play, she's only realising true love at the twilight of her life. Now, the key part of Romeo and Juliet as a play is it is not a love story. It's been bandied about as the greatest love story of all time. This is a Victorian advertising invention to make it a social thing for folk must go and see this. You can't afford to miss it. It's a tragedy voiced through a love story. And the tragedy is really Juliet's tragedy. The tragedy is not merely that they die at the end. It's not that they die so young. The tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, as that Juliet died. I don't really know much about Juliet before this play. Her life begins when she meets Romeo. She goes through this transportation from maiden to wife to widow, which is what her mother and the nurse were setting out for her at the beginning of the play, saying this is a path you should go down with Paris, who's often maligned, but it's actually a very good match at the time. This is ideal. Juliet's fully okay with it. This is the path she's going to go down. The mother and the nurse are saying, it's the path we went down. It's okay, everything's going to be fine. And everything is going to be fine until she meets Romeo and all bets are off. It goes completely off at a tangent. And she goes down that path. Instead of taking 30 or 40 or even 50 years, it takes 5 days. And that's the tragedy of it all. But as to why it's the forgotten Juliet, it's forgotten because, as I said, it wasn't shown on television. I've never seen it on television at any time. It fell out of favour because it was eclipsed by Zeffirelli. Zeffirelli's Juliet chapter would be called Juliet Rules the World. It took over everything. And one of the famous Shakespearean critics, whose name escapes me, is quoted as saying, everything good and bad in Shakespeare is related to Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. So that eclipsed the whole thing. Also the fact that she turned down Grace Kelly's film contract. When Grace Kelly got married, the film company saw her, thought she looks just like her, she's coming out, she's made this film, she's pretty good in this film. They offered her Grace Kelly's film contract and she turned it down. That's quite astonishing in today's age where everyone wants to be a superstar, everyone wants to be an influencer on YouTube, be on some reality program, making an absolute fool of themselves so they can get 5 minutes of fame, embarrassing bodies. They're so embarrassed to go on live television to show off, all for a bit of fame. This was a young woman who was very satisfied with her life, very secure in their own setting. She got engaged during the film. Not to, some people said she was engaged to a film technician who worked on the film during the film. That's nonsense. She got engaged to someone they had met on holiday, when family on holiday in Woolacombe Bay, I think. I'm not sure about that. And he was in the fruit and vegetable business, as her father was as well, I think. And they remained happy. She didn't apply for anything. I've got a letter from her, which was taken from, at the closing party of the film, one of the producers bet her £10 that within, I think it was six weeks or 6 months or 3 months or something, she would have accepted another film role. And she accepted the bet and she won the bet. She wasn't interested in becoming a film star. It was just that quirky thing. And of course, only having made one film, no one's going to know her from anything else. And that film fell out of favour fairly quickly. So, but I think it deserves to be seen. It's not the greatest Romeo and Juliet in the history of the world, but it's certainly made with conviction, misdirected in some ways, but certainly worth watching for if nothing else, the references to Renaissance art and the great settings, some of which are. But even at that point, there's strange things. There's a scene Benvolio running down the street and he stops and looks right and left because he's looking for traffic. They hadn't sealed off the roads and he was looking so he doesn't get run down by traffic. There are concrete bollards outside, traffic bollards outside one of the churches. There are electric cables running down some of the pillars in one of the scenes. And there's actually even a magazine picture stuck to the wall of Friar Lawrence's cell. You can see the paper curling up at the end. So there's all these little things which are an imbalance, and the costumes, a visual imbalance. They're quite striking, but they're at odds with the background and the scenery. So it's an interesting, strange little film. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I've got a question, unless someone else has. I've got a couple of questions, Tony. So the first one is totally related to Shakespeare only rather than Shakespeare on film. And it's the fact that you know, I mean, her father proposes, or proposes, kind of organizes for her to marry Paris.
Yes.
Just the day after, on the wake of the funeral or of the murder of her cousin Tybalt.
Yeah.
And that to me reminds me a lot of, for example, Hamlet, when, you know, on the wake of the funeral of the king, you know, his mother marries his uncle Claudius. Was there something about this, you know, I found that, you know, because you talk about Juliet's tragedy as, you know, her life being compressed and going from maiden to wife to widow within 5 days.
Yeah.
And it's the same here. Was there a tradition that, you know, or an explanation why someone would be organized to get married just after a funeral, for example? I don't know if it's something that happened.
Well, no, it's two different things. In Romeo and Juliet,
yeah,
the marriage is agreed before the funeral. You just haven't set a date.
okay.
And the thing about, and there's a lot of research into this, which explains Capulet's rage later on. I think it was Theatre of Chicago, and they're doing the method acting thing, and they were trying to find out what is the feud all about. Drive these two things, and there's a whole story in there. I mentioned earlier on that they used, when he's talking about Old Freetown, to give her common judgment. Common means actually public judgment. Now, in the beginning of this play is famously from ancient grudge. Ancient is taken by a lot of people to mean lost in the mists of time, sort of like back in, you know, Lord of the Rings times time. But the word ancient is used 6 or 8 times in this play. And it refers to, I think the friar refers to his own ancient ears. We talk about the ancient citizens of Verona. There's another ancient thing about people. I think Mercutio calls the nurse ancient. It just means old. It doesn't mean at all. The quarrel is between our masters and us, their men, not just the quarrel between our masters and us, their men. The Chicago think group came back and they thought that, and there's other things going on about when Romeo is going out with Rosaline or pursuing Rosaline, no one says to him, you can't do that, she's a Capulet. The friar doesn't say anything to it. His friends don't say anything to it. They only do it with Juliet, who is the daughter. Now, the theory put forward to them was that when he was younger, Capulet wanted to marry Lady Montague and was turned down because he wasn't good enough. And this hurt him enormously. So the fact that he has made himself rich and all this, and this both alike in dignity is also very important, because it's not so much what the feud's about, it's what it's not about. It's not about international war, because they're both in the same place. It's not about civil war. It's not a class war, because they're both rich. It's not a political war, because they're both allied to the prince. And you go through things, and the only thing that's left that comes down to is it's a personal thing. And that ties in, what the Chicago people suggested ties in, because that makes a lot of things, it all falls into place, nothing falls out of place. And it also justifies, to a large extent, Capulet's rage when Juliet says she's not going to marry Paris. Because Paris is portrayed in films a lot of time as, Baz Luhrmann called him a loser, because they want Romeo to be the hero. It's a very, very good match. He is, as they say, a man of wax, meaning like the moon waxing, he's on the up. His star is rising. It is the best marriage they could arrange. And arranged marriages at that time were the commonplace. So that was very good. It was arranged and agreed, albeit a bit reluctantly, by Juliet's father at the time, that they were going to marry. It was a case of the date had not been set. The date is set to try and lift her out of the feelings they believe because her cousin has been murdered. In Hamlet, there's a whole, it's a rabbit hole to go down. in Hamlet and dramatic irony and what the audience know, what Shakespeare knows, what Hamlet knows, what Hamlet thinks he knows.
Mhm.
In Hamlet, suspects very much, well, you know, that his father's been killed by his uncle, right? And he's also thinks, although it's not proven in the play, I'm trying to remember this, that he thinks his mother and his uncle have been having an affair before this, and also inferred in the play, but not actually stated. What then goes through Hamlet's head is a sort of down the line of, well, if my mother was having an affair with him, is there anyone else she'd be having an affair with? And it goes down the lines of, well, the only cuts down to the people who are in court of a resident who have the same age, who had been at court for a long time, and you end up with Ophelia's father.
Mhm.
So he's beginning to think, is Hamlet and Ophelia, are they actually related in some way?
Mhm.
It all gets a bit confusing. And also the thing about was to replace the king. A dead king had to be replaced very quickly. There's a German version of Hamlet in print, and I think there was a silent version made of it, which was quite good, in which Hamlet is actually a girl. That when the mother was giving birth to Hamlet, gave birth to a girl, she received news that the king had been killed in battle. So in order to try and keep the nation unified, she set out the story that she had given birth to a boy, a prince, who was going to lead to the kingdom. But in fact, it was a girl. And the girl lives her life disguised as a boy. And there's a whole, and then the king comes back. He's not dead at all. But he thinks he has a daughter. No, he thinks he has a son instead of a daughter. And it all gets very confusing. But the part of the marriage so soon after the funeral in Hamlet is just to have a king on the throne.
Yeah.
To keep things going. And the thing about Romeo and Juliet is that's the marriage had already been agreed, and it's just brought forward in a vain attempt to try and lift her from depression of
and the family as well, probably.
Yeah.
Just to celebrate with positive the recent death for the Capulets. Okay, okay, makes sense. I also think, if maybe I may be wrong, you know, you're the Shakespearean expert here, but I think I remember that also in Hamlet there was a reference to the political scene when I think Hamlet was written and performed when James the Sixth and First was already king, and so there was that kind of succession from Elizabeth I to King.
King James,
King, who was son of Mary, Queen of Scots.
Queen of Scots, yeah.
So, and on that comment, because I wanted to go back to Castellani, and I didn't plan it that way, but it just, as it came out, I thought it would be making quite sense, because you went back, you mentioned that in the same year, La Strada by Fellini came out, and also Senso by Visconti. And Senso is also the first Technicolor film that Visconti had in 1954. And it's quite interesting because Senso, you know, talking about the reference from, for example, not Romeo and Juliet at this point, but maybe, I'm not quite sure there, but maybe Hamlet to the current affairs and the history in the real England then. Senso was very much created to expose a scandal of how the Italian nation was made. And this is the annexation of Italy, of Venice, of the Venetian region, in which Verona is also, but it doesn't really matter here, to Italy in 1866. And I think in 1954, there was a very big division in the Italian government as well. And what Visconti did in this film was using color, because also Visconti, like Castellani, was a realist Visconti used Technicolor and also filming the opulence that you mentioned before in Castellani's Romeo and Juliet as an ironical stance of what was going on in Italy at that time. At that time, that was still the, you know, the kind of, it's not the post-war years, but it was still, you know, not very stable years in Italy, politically, economically, and so on and so forth. And so I'm just wondering whether that's maybe the reason why Castellani, who was a neorealist and who produced, directed films which are much more sort of black and white and neorealist, although Visconti was an aesthetist anyway. Visconti always looked at the details of things, and he was very much, but you know, he had films which were pretty grim before, and Castellani did too. I wonder if that year in particular, in 1954, with Senso there and with Castellani, maybe, I'm not quite sure if maybe Castellani won for some sort of reason that would have also made Senso a huge hit, which it was. Even
I don't know. I said I don't think there was a jury in the Venice Film Festival at that point. There certainly wasn't when it was introduced. When it came back, 1947, there was no jury, so I don't know who picked it. I think the whole idea of reclaiming Romeo and Juliet as an Italian story, I think, appealed to a great many people.
Yeah.
To bring it back, because I said Shakespeare's been used as an academic club, a cultural club to beat down other cultures. So claiming it back as their own.
But also, you know, I mean, because my question is a bit long and complicated, because we had a quick chat, me and Tony, a couple of evenings ago, and you know, and I was mentioning that, you know, so the story of the annexation of Venice to Italy in 1866, which is very much the making of the Italian nation between 1860 and 1871, roughly, okay? And the book, the novel, which came to symbolize that part of the Italian history, was a novel called The Betrothed by a writer called Alessandro Manzoni, which is the equivalent of Sir Walter Scott in Scotland. And I, you know, the Romeo and Juliet, the way it is staged here, the way, for example, Susan Shentall, who is the heroine, and she's all caged up, and you know, in the balcony there's bars everywhere. She's shown as the symbol of purity with the lily, and in everything she, you know, what she wears, etc. Reminds me very much of the character, the heroine of this Betrothed, which was in Lucia. She was called Lucia, and she was definitely the pure virgin girl that was to be married. She's not high class, she's very low class. And Renzo, who is the other betrothed, their boyfriend, her boyfriend to be, they have to part. And then in the end, you know, it's a very Catholic-based book. So in the end, they do get married in the church and everything. But instead of being Romeo, the one who leaves and is sent away from the city to, you know, because he killed Tybalt, is, you know, banned from his own city, and he has to leave, and he has to wait until things are resolved, okay, through a monk, you know, through the friar. Well, in The Betrothed, it is Lucia that has to leave, and she leaves by help of a monk to another town, you know, beyond, you know, into the Venetian region, from the Lombardy region, which is where Milan is, roughly. And so there is this, and then Renzo is seen as the flaneur, as the vagabondo, which, by the way, in Italy was, you know, an outlaw. If you were a vagabondo, you were an outlaw at the time. You know, there's quite a lot of similarities, I think. And Lucia is also caged, you know, because she is sent to a monastery and then she's kidnapped again and sent into, she's a prisoner very much. And I just wonder if there is some sort of trait in the Romeo and Juliet recreated by Castellani, which reminds us of the betrothed. And I wanted to show you a couple of images as well, because I was looking at them today. And for which reason also Saying So by Visconti was actually a hit in the same year, but didn't win Venice. If there was some sort of interest at the time to talk about the making of Italy and the political problems that Italy was going through, and maybe Romeo and Juliet had been adapted to show that in a way which reminded us of the Italian national novel, which is The Betrothed. I see a lot of similarities in that, but it's a very, very long story I've recounted. I don't know if there's something that maybe you had to say, Tony, or if there's
well, no, I don't know the film. I would imagine that we're interested in the unification of Italy primarily in Italy.
Do you know Senso? But do you know Senso? Have you seen?
No, I don't know Senso. I've seen, it's the one of those four, that's the one I have not seen. I've seen La Strada because it's Uncle Tony that's in it, Anthony Quinn. Seven Samurai on the Waterfront. I haven't seen Senso. No.
Well, Anthony Quinn, your
my uncle, yes.
Your homonymous, yeah. Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's something about which is Castellani thought, yes, let's reclaim Romeo and Juliet, but there is an extra reason to reclaim Romeo and Juliet because of so much. Because, you know, now realists were interested in exposing the faults of Italy. The faults of, you know, the war, the post-war, the current problems, a very political film. And also the very fact that it is slightly kind of a bit of a pastiche, really, some places. And then also you say, you know, there's some mistakes as well. I wonder if that was part of an irony that Castellani applied to it rather than mistakes. You know, I'm just wondering, you know, if there was, because Visconti definitely was an ironist, you know, behind this perfect screen. I wonder if Castellani did the same, you know, because that thing that you say splattered on the wall and then scrambled up on the corner, and then the whole idea of making a huge mistake with the habits of the friar. Is that irony? Are those mistakes meant to be mistakes? That's what
I think the mistakes, the fading to black and inserting little scenes, which I did throughout the film as well. I think that is to try and change the timeline. One of the versions, the earlier Italian versions, I can't remember which one, the story takes place over a year and a half.
Yeah.
And I think Romeo ends up getting beheaded. You know, there's not a lot of laughs in this. And I think it was just a case of to move it away from Shakespeare. As I said, it would have been interesting to see if he'd had the money to allow that. We mentioned the other night pink neorealism.
Yeah.
And I looked into it briefly, and Castellani's name came up. And it was
of course, yeah.
in pink neorealism, and some of the films they'd made before this, they were saying that was some people, it's not a very, I'd never heard of the term before, I don't know how widespread it is. They're saying that neorealism had sort of reached the end of its shelf life after coming out from the rubble from the war, it said, and Castellani used it with a bit of humour.
Yeah,
and they're saying that was a betrayal to neorealism, you know, because people get very, very defensive of it at all.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know.
There's different schools of thought about when neorealism ended. Some people felt that it ended in 1949 when Fellini did the Nights of Cabiria. I don't know if you know that film. Cabiria. And then some people thought that neorealism stopped around 1956 because that's when Italy started to be richer and started to be more stable. But then some people say that neorealism continued in 1960 up to about 1960. And then it stopped with 1962, La Dolce Vita. So there's lots of different...
There's a very good, well, I'll use this, there's a film called After the Fox, stars Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers. And it was written by Neil Simon and I think Zavattini.
Zavattini,
yeah. And there's a scene in the film, I thought it was very good, where Victor Mature is playing an American film star in Italy. And he's in his hotel room and the phone goes and it's some Italian director. And I think it's his secretary's answered the phone and said, he wants you to star in a neo-realism film. And the Victor Mature character says, what's neo-realism? And the secretary says, no money.
No budget.
No money. And that was part of the thing about pink neorealism, because neorealism, there was a school of thought saying it was against what they called the white telephone movies. Prior to that, the sort of Fred Astaire thing where everyone lives in huge, big, high-ceilinged hotels with the stage months and everyone flies down to
very
Rio for the weekend,
So
they were trying to get away from that. And in this version of Romeo and Juliet, they say bits of that are coming in, the actual opulence that's coming in. And the thing about Visconti had a long personal relationship with Zeffirelli. Pardon me, and Zeffirelli's quoted as saying that one of the first things Visconti taught him was, if it looks real, people will believe that it is real. Now, there's a conflict, I said, a visual conflict in this version of Romeo and Juliet with the costumes. The thing, Benvolio wears 3 different costumes before 9 o'clock in the morning on the first day. And one of them is really quite striking. It's like Houpenard sort of wearing, it's green and black, very striking things. And even when they're fighting, Castellani said he took with him on set like a little painters, like you get into shops now, all different colours of paint on them, with all different names like Morning Cloud, Heather, Dusk, and all that sort of thing. He took these on set to make sure that a magenta didn't cross in front of an orange or whatever. And he says it took him a month to work that out on its own. It took him a month. Now, if you're spending a month on the colours of costumes that are being designed by someone else, you're not spending that time on focusing on the complexities of the text or anything else. So that did cause an imbalance. I think his intentions were good. I think he lacked discipline, self-discipline. And I think perhaps, joking aside, it was too much money for him. I've got all this money, what am I going to spend it on? Bring in all these costumes, make references to these paintings.
Yeah, there's definitely, there is just say flaunting of Italian culture, even out of place sometimes, and also I think we were saying that the other evening, that maybe that a reference to the betrothed may be a flaunting also of literature, of Italian literature there, because there's sculpture, there's painting, there's frescoes, there's buildings, even in the wrong places, I'm just wondering also that about the irony, any Italian who would have traveled, maybe not in 1954, I'm not really quite sure, but any Italian who would have traveled Italy a little bit would have known that the cathedral is not in Verona, but it's in Siena,
there's actually, I've got from Susan Shentall's family, I've got some of the shooting script. And even things like the wedding scene that we saw there, that's filmed in 2 different churches, different parts of Italy, they edited it together. So there's a lot of places just going to things and making it look, but that happens everywhere. I think if you look at the trailer, and I noticed it for something we would know in Edinburgh, Trainspotting 2. And they run down one street and suddenly they're in a completely different part of Edinburgh. But it's filmed so it looks as if it's just a continuation of it. It's not something that's specific to this film.
But then and also I know Villafranca Veneta really well, so it was quite nice to see the walls, the ramparts there again. Is there anybody that has a question? Because I wanted to show you just a couple of pictures as well from the betrothed, just to You know, just out of curiosity, but anybody else would like to ask a question?
No, I think we're out of questions.
Can I reclaim the
Please do, yeah.
host? Yeah, I've done it now. Yeah, okay. So I didn't want to do it before because this would happen. You would lose your. I'll give them back to you, but I just wanted to share. That's why I needed them to share the pictures that I wanted to show people here. So here we go. So let's see if I can share them now. So these are images. These are images from the post that I was showing Tony a little bit earlier, you know. So there's a kind of balcony, which to me looks quite encaged as well. And I wonder, you know, because you said that, for example, in the Norma Shearer, you know, the version, you know, the 1936 version where Norma Shearer plays Juliet, you know, they searched so vastly for the right balcony in Italy, which would represent, you know, the cincture of the Virgin Mary, and also the kind of for the purity of Juliet, and also the type of balcony which is round. And here it's a type of balcony which I wonder, you know, I'm just thinking of that. This is one of the first editions of the Betrothed. And then, of course, it's all sort of Catholic, because they're under the, you know, this is Lucia under the wings and the protection of the angel. Nothing happens to her. She's married in the end. Everybody wanted to abuse her. And then there was something else I wanted to show you, was how she is portrayed. Let's see if I can see the picture here, as saintly. Or maybe it's the other one. Just reminding us of, sorry about that. Or maybe it's in another one. Maybe it's another picture I found somewhere else. Here it is. You know, so again, Lucia, and you were talking about her kneeling and praying in front of a
votive candle. Yeah, votive candle and a picture of the Virgin Mary. Yes.
Here's something quite similar. Lucia in the Betrothed. And you know, when I was seeing these things, I kind of had a feeling about it. And then I saw them and I thought, like, oh, I wonder, you know, so just as an extra hint of
well, a strange thing about the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet is Romeo and Juliet's one of his earliest plays. Now, he wrote close to 40 plays, 37, 38, and never did another balcony scene. Because it's quite ironic, I think, that it's probably the most famous visual scene in all of Shakespeare. The most famous line is probably "to be or not to be," but visually the most famous scene of all of Shakespeare is the boy beneath the balcony and the girl on the balcony, Romeo and Juliet. Now, early editions of it, the balcony was really the place above the stage where the musicians would go. And Romeo would stand in front and he's speaking up to Juliet. Now, in order to do that, he had to turn his back on the audience. This is where the saying comes from, never turn your back on the audience. To turn your back on the audience in Elizabethan times was a great insult. Queen Elizabeth had one of her courtiers beheaded because he turned his back on her. It was a hugely offensive thing to do. So when Romeo went to give his speech in front of the balcony, he got pelted with stuff from the audience. The groundlings, as they were called, stood on the ground. That was I was going to say cheap seats, but there were no seats. You could stand. They were quite drunk, a lot of them. And he never ever did that again. And it wasn't until, I think it was John Gielgud's, Laurence Olivier's version of the stage for Romeo and Juliet, they moved the balcony over to the right as you're looking at it and angled it slightly. And beside that, they had two parallel roads coming down at an angle towards the centre of the stage. And that setting is more or less kept for all versions of Romeo and Juliet. Now, coming down these two roots were the two families with the deaths of people after the brawl. And it could also mean that when Romeo is speaking to Juliet on the balcony, he's standing at the side and in profile, as opposed to standing with his back to the audience at all. So it's quite an interesting thing. I think no other balcony scene in Shakespeare, and it's probably the one scene which he's most famous for, and apparently he didn't like it.
Okay, and so yeah, I mean, I've got, unless there are any other questions, I had an apology for two people who were supposed to be here but couldn't make it, so they're just saying please apologize to Tony. They're looking forward to seeing the recording, and then I don't know if maybe it's about 20 to
9.
If anybody has a final question, please do now, or otherwise we maybe just want to just 1, 2, 3. Maybe we can close here. And thank you again. I mean, I really enjoyed this this talk. It just shows the different, you know, I mean, even if it's one play in 4 different films plus the ones we've lost, but every one of them has got a fascinating story and reasons and type of research that the directors and the keep made to create them, and you know, as you say, maybe the Zeffirelli is the one that surpasses them all. I think the 1996 is the one that surpasses them all for originality. I mean, from my viewpoint, is the one that I probably enjoyed most is Zeffirelli, but probably first of all the Luhrmann, you know, Baz Luhrmann.
Yeah.
I think for me is my favorite.
Luhrmann got such a hard time from the critics at first, and it wasn't because of what he'd done to Shakespeare, it's because of what he'd done to Zeffirelli. But he actually took one of my favourite critical insults that I've ever heard anyone write about a film. I thought it was wonderful. I forget the chap's name, but I remember the quote. He said, "There are bad films, there are worst films of all time, and then there's Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet."
So one apart for no, I mean, yeah, because even the scene in the vault, you know, in this one, which I actually felt Paris quite endearing when he's just about to die and say, "Please do me a favor, lay me next to Juliet." So obviously Paris loved Juliet, you know.
Yeah.
We don't look at Paris's feelings, we just look at the fact that we wanted Juliet and Romeo together because they were married and they loved each other and so on and so forth. And that, you know, the fact that it goes down from a tombstone, but then it goes into a common vault. So maybe that was her tombstone, I don't know.
Well, the tombstone.
It was so natural. It was so natural, that scene, compared to Luhrmann's in the cathedral with all the candles. That was so atmospheric and so beautiful. And this one was...
Well, the one about the one in 1954, this one, the entrance to the tomb is different from Shakespeare's text. Normally, the tomb is behind people. So they can, and he talks about the jaws to jaw open the tomb doors, so they can open the tomb doors and you can see inside.
Yeah.
In the film version, this film version, as you said, it's like removing the slab from the top of the tomb and then going down rungs of ladders, which is ridiculous because, you know, why would you do that? How could you lower a body down that way? And then at the end, they have 16 bishops and people marching down these very, you know, wide steps. That's, you know, it doesn't make much sense they did it at all. But I think that was partly because there is somewhere, I can't remember where, in Italy, supposedly the grave of the original Juliet, the tombstone, and it's like that shape.
It is it? Right.
Cuboid shape sort of thing at all.
I never seen that.
But as I said, the brutality of the murder of Paris, which is left out of quite a lot of productions, and then going down in that tomb, and then at the very end, the tomb just being at the foot of this great cathedral.
Which probably, I'm sure it would have had its own entrance from the cathedral, as most crypts and vaults do. but maybe it was not accessible. It was the easiest way was to go down from the tombstone. I'm not really quite sure where that was filmed, but to me it looked really unnatural. And also the way
the cathedral is in Verona. I've got the name of it, but not with me just now. But I don't know where the actual rising open of the tomb lid. I don't know where that was filmed.
Okay, right. Yeah.
But the cathedral is certainly it's in Verona. St. Anastasia's, I think it might be. I'm not sure.
Okay, right. I don't know about that. So I don't know Verona as well as that to know the name of the cathedral. Yeah, I couldn't remember that. But anyway, yeah. But I just and also the way the stone, you know, the tomb stone, it's so difficult for him to lift, etc. And then it becomes like polystyrene at the end. He's just kind of pushing it. So I thought, and that's why you think, like, are these genuine mistakes, or is it just pulling? Is it just making fun? Is it just making fun of?
No, some of it's certainly mistakes.
Not of Shakespeare, of cinema. Is making fun of opulent cinema, for example.
No, I don't think so. I think some of it is mistakes. Some of it was deliberate.
Yeah.
The time lapsing, the fade to black was deliberate. Absolutely, there's no doubt about that at all.
Yeah.
But the other things, continuity things, not so much. But the cabling down the back of the pillar, the slip poster on the wall. These are details you wouldn't notice at the time.
Yeah, that's why I'm wondering, are they there on purpose? Because I know that one trait of neorealism was also its anti-Hollywood nature.
Yeah.
And so, by trying to bring in a Hollywood Technicolor film, which was not Hollywood as much as was the 1936 version, of course, but then, making these mistakes so clear and so in your face. I'm just wondering if it was Castellani trying to make fun of Hollywood by using Technicolor. But
I think he was too preoccupied with Technicolor. He wasn't focusing on other parts of it. Yeah. As I said, he spent a month organising the colours of costumes and choreography that one would not cut in front of another, walk in front of another. These are details which don't deserve that much attention.
Yeah.
And by focusing on that, he's not focusing on anything else. But it could also be the whole thing, as I said jokingly, about too much money.
Okay.
All the stuff about the Renaissance art, the references. That was just a few that I showed earlier on. There will be others in there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And there's someone make the reference to Lady Capulet's hair based on another painting. I couldn't find the painting, so I didn't include it.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much of it is true. The costumes worn by Princess Aeschylus and other people, you think it just doesn't look right. It causes a visual imbalance.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
that bit could be deliberate because he employed Leonard Finney, the Italian surrealist painter, to design the costumes.
Yeah.
That may have been, I don't know, Salvador Dali produced scenes for films. Picasso did sets for a film, for a ballet. So perhaps he was just trying to be part of the greater, wider art.
Yeah. No, but that's interesting how, okay. I'm going to watch it again because I want to see all these extra things in more detail. I want to watch these, because I never noticed the cabling, but I want to see it now.
No, don't let it spoil your film. It's worth watching. Definitely. There's another edit when Benvolio is running up a street and it cuts and he's suddenly further up the street. And I thought, something's happened. A car has gone past or something in one of the crossing streets, and they've just cut it out.
Okay.
They haven't refilmed it because you see the jump of he's suddenly further up the street.
Okay.
And there's definitely frames have been cut out.
Yeah.
I remember counting out, 24 frames per second was so far up here.
And
I thought that would tie in with the speed of a car just going in front of that there.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Yeah. Anyway, but thanks very much again, Tony.